said you're an expert.
I teach ancient history. I've been studying ancient history for many years.
The imagination side of saying it could just be this or it could just be that. Do you think that's what happened?
Once you learn how to do the research, you've now learned how to approach any subject. Maybe people from Egypt came to America and taught them how to make pyramids. Well, we call it a pyramid, the step thing that we have here, and we know from other indications, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host, Derek Lambert. This is MythVision Podcast. I have an expert archaeologist joining us today, Dr. David Miano. Welcome to MythVision for your first time.
Hey, thanks for having me, Derek.
Thank you. I said you're an expert. And so if you don't mind, could you tell us what your expertise is, where you got your education?
I'm an expert in a very narrow set of subjects. Everything else, I'm kind of a dumbbell. But anyway, I teach ancient history. I've been studying ancient history for many years. So anything from the rise of the first cities, the beginnings of writing, up until the beginning of medieval times. Maybe around the year 600-ish or so. So that's a long span of time that I cover, but I think it's a lot of fun. I originally studied, and this is my area of original focus, the ancient Near East. But since then, a YouTube channel, World of Antiquity, I've been doing pretty much the whole world in ancient times. And I like that because I can compare, like, what's going on over here when this is going on over there. And so I've kind of become a generalist over the last few years.
There's so many things I want to just praise about that, and the fact that you're actually facing public world with this academic research and having a skill set on knowing how to research into areas that aren't your specialty and seeing what the experts say in that. This discussion, I hope, will help people who are online hearing ideas on TikTok, on YouTube that sound cool. They sound fun. I was a sucker for them. About 4 to 7 years ago, anything Randall Carlson put out, anything Graham Hancock said on Joe Rogan's podcast, I was just involved. I thought, for me, it's almost like this weird myth or belief that we have amnesia, we have forgotten some previous point where we reached this pinnacle of society and then all went to hell because of asteroid or a solar flare, or whatever the different catastrophe was. There's something interesting about that psychologically and cool.
Yeah, it's a very attractive idea. Yeah.
Right. Been here before, right? Like,
oh, yeah. What's that line from Battlestar Galactica? It's like it all happened before and it will happen again or something.
Right.
Yes.
This is an attractive.
I think Battlestar Galactica is kind of based on some of those ideas.
It wouldn't shock me one bit, because there's something cool about that. And even in the reverse, like the recent show Fallout, that game, I loved that game. Fallout 3, New Vegas 4, post-apocalyptic. Yeah. What is it like after the apocalypse happens? Completely get indulged into this imaginative, fictive world where radiation has covered the surface and those who are in the ground live a completely different life. But there's all sorts of cool stuff to think about with that, and people are into it. My point is I began to want to know what the truth was. What is the most likely situation? And once you start learning that, you think it's going to make you turn off and go, oh man, I'm not into this. It actually becomes even more interesting to discover how we really, in my opinion, instead of having a fictional fake myth, believing about our past and wishing that it was like this, maybe we've been here before, finding out what the reality is just as shocking, if not more so, of how humans came to be the way we are.
Yeah, I mean, some people think of mainstream history as boring. I don't think it's boring, but I realize that, archaeology, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm a historian, but archaeology is mostly digging up a lot of pottery fragments and things like that, which are not the most exciting thing in the world. And so people would rather it be like Indiana Jones or something, and they love the mystique of it. And so I think that's why a lot of people like these ideas that bring in some kind of mystique. But there is still a lot of mystery out there, right? We still don't know a lot. For some reason, mainstream historians have this reputation among those people that oh, they think they have it all figured out. They know all the answers. They don't want to hear anything new. But in my experience, historians and archaeologists and people like that are always trying to search for answers to mysteries and look for clues for things we didn't know about before. In fact, who today online on my YouTube channel, I'm thought of as, this by the book kind of mainstream guy that, just says whatever I'm told to say. In grad school, I had a reputation for always wanting to push the boundaries and things like that. But people don't know that side of me. But I do have that side as well.
What do you think happened? Do you think, I mean, there's still that side of you, as you just
Yeah,
said, but
it's still there.
do you think when you start to realize how much rigorous research, I almost want to use the word Dunning-Kruger, that there's a sense in which you learn so much that you start to realize why mainstream archaeologists or historians or scientists or whatever have come to conclusions that they do, or at least draw the best inference based on the data they have, that you calmed down a little bit on the imagination side of saying it could just be this or it could just be that? Do you think that's what happened?
Maybe a lot of it is the rigor involved. Yes. I mean, you have to, once you learn how to do the research, right? You go through training, you learn how to do the research, you learn how to strengthen your argument, you know how to examine the evidence and make sure that whatever you propose has some support and all of that. You learn all the historical method, all of that. You've now learned how to approach any subject. And so, but then when you do that, and people who don't know about the historical method and all that, you do that, you're rigorous about it, they just think of it as, oh, you're set in your ways, you don't want to think outside the box. And I said this in my recent video on Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock, the more knowledge you have of the facts, right, the more evidence you're aware of, the more context you have for what the area that you're studying, the fewer possible explanations are for what you see, right? It's only when you don't fully study the subject that you think, oh, this could be true or that could be true. And there's so many options, So yeah, your options get reduced the more you know. And then it looks to people on the outside as if you're closed-minded.
Exactly. This is my experience, because what we mostly do on MythVision right now, and we're expanding into arenas that aren't necessarily just Bible. We like to dive into myths that may have influenced the Bible, similar myths to what we find in Greece and Ugarit, Mesopotamia, Egypt, things like that. Like, I'm a big myth guy. I love myths and how stories change and develop, where they come from, potentially who borrowed from whom, maybe all that kind of stuff. And the more you look into it, the less you think, oh, well, I found this myth that looks similar to China. And you got, well, you don't jump to that's the
Yeah.
connection,
There's
because
a lot of that in
Huh?
in pseudo-archaeology. There's a lot of comparing. Now they see that scholars actually do comparative study,
Mhm.
but they kind of go a little bit overboard looking for parallels, right? So not only parallels between stories, but parallels between artifacts and things like that. Oh, look at this is shaped like this, and this thing from across the world is also shaped like that. Maybe they knew each other, or maybe there's a connection. But sometimes it's just a coincidence, But they don't see the possibility of coincidences. They're like, no, there's got to be a connection. And then you say, well, wait a minute, we've scientifically dated this object, and it's from like 2,000 years after this other object, and it's 5,000 miles away. How could there be a connection, But they're like, oh, well, you must have dated it wrong, or they think, but looking for similarities, sometimes it's called parallelomania, They do this in literature a lot too. Doesn't
Mhm.
automatically mean there's a connection.
Right.
There could be some general ideas going around that they're both drawing from, but the further away they are from each other, and the less similarity that you have, the less likely that there's a connection. Some things are just natural human responses to things, like they say pyramids. Well, look at there's a pyramid in Egypt, and then there's a pyramid over here in Mesoamerica. Maybe people from Egypt came to America and taught them how to make pyramids, things like that. When really you're just talking about a building that's bigger on the bottom and smaller on the top, which is the easiest kind of building to make. You give a child a set of blocks, they're probably going to end up making a pyramid out of it, at some point or another. Yeah. And also we call things pyramids that are not always exactly pyramids, like the Egyptian pyramids, smooth-sided. This is an actual pyramid shape. Where do you see the actual pyramid shape, smooth sides, real pyramid, anywhere else? Very rare. Well, we call it a pyramid, the step thing that we have here, and so they think, oh, there might be a connection, but sometimes it's just a coincidence. You have to have more than just a couple of similarities to see a link. You have to, there has to be other cultural elements that indicate, that they knew each other,
Right.
other evidence that indicate that they knew each other or something. Like being from the same time period. It would be a good one.
Yeah,
But yeah.
location, time period. There's so many factors scholars really want to try and be careful about. And I get it. You talked about pyramids, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the first thing I had in mind, was to discuss that with you, and you kind of nailed it just saying that.
Oh,
But you
sorry
can
if
even
I
go,
got ahead of you.
yeah, no, good. That's actually perfect, because that tells me we're on the same track. Of course, this is the basic thing we see all over the internet. And then you see like even the types of gods, bird gods, things like that. And it's like, oh, I think Mini Minuteman Milo, he's did like some debunk of a TikToker who's like a total conspiracy theorist. And he points out like, oh my God, bird gods, like there aren't birds in the sky. And like, like it's the phenomena that you're going to see, humans are going to have the inclination to create stories about. And there's even Native American stories about shamanistic magicians in the belly of fish and things, fish type humans and whatnot. And it's like, oh, we've heard this kind of story with Jonah, or the story that you can hear with Perseus and Heracles and Arion with dolphins and things like that. And it's like, they must know each other. And I mean, obviously you could do that with region and other skilled expertise looking close at those stories that might have been circulating in that region of the Mediterranean. But just because over here in Mesoamerica, you have these traditions, I mean, there are fish in the water. Humans are going to have these, or worshiping the sun.
Yeah. Or
we all
just
have the
putting
same
an animal part on a human body. They do this a lot, where you put an animal head on a human body. There's all these hybrid creatures, and you see that in a lot of mythologies. It doesn't necessarily mean they got the idea from the other person, right? Because people can imagine this. Well, what if there's like, a dog head on a human body? You can think of that without somebody teaching it to you,
Right.
Now, there are some people who think it's real, like, well, maybe they were doing genetic engineering, and
that's the
did you ever
fun
hear
part.
that one? Yeah.
I would like to ask you, pertaining to the pyramids, I'm
By
sure
the way,
you
when I chuckle, I don't want people to think I'm making fun. I just find the ideas interesting. Some of the ideas are humorous, but I don't want people to think that I'm mocking people. I don't really want to mock people, but I do think some ideas are somewhat humorous. Anyway.
I have to admit, if I'm chuckling, it's probably because I think they're silly. But it's because I understand that, because I used to think some silly things myself. So I kind of am laughing at myself in a way and going, oh my gosh, why did I think that? I mean, I did kind of go into this possibility of like portals and magnetic energy sources and all that. You've seen it. What do you do with Randall Carlson, for example, when he calculates these numbers? Dibble did a little funny 420 joke with numbers, and every time what do you do with Randall Carlson's numbers? Have you ever dealt with that in particular?
I did. I just recently did a video, maybe like a month ago or so, on Randall Carlson's Great Pyramid hypothesis, which since I made the video, I've learned that he actually pulled it from somebody from the 1800s or something. But anyway,
wow,
or somebody from a while ago, maybe early 20th century. But this idea, numbers being encoded into ancient artifacts, it's an interesting idea. And it does go back to earlier times, because people were into numerology and all that kind of stuff. And the Great Pyramid has been the subject of all kinds of theories for a long time. But yes, this idea of like, well, maybe whoever built this pyramid or whatever it is, maybe they encoded numbers into it as a message to people in the future. And we just have to figure out what's in it, what is. And so they measure all the sides and the angles and everything in the object. And this is what Randall Carlson does. And then he compares it to numbers from scientific measurements, like let's measure what's the radius of the Earth, what's the diameter, and taking measurements of the Earth or of the distance to the sun or moon or whatever, all of this, and seeing if you can find a match, right? And then what he does is, in addition to doing that, if he can't find a match, he will bring in additional numbers. He says, well, if you bring in these sacred numbers, and you multiply the sacred number by the measurement, then you get a match with some, scientific measurement. And they must have meant to put that into the pyramid or whatever it is, right? But the problem with that is you're kind of just making the numbers work, right? You're looking for any kind of link that you can. Oh, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Oh, this could work. But if we did it, we have to divide it by this number and then multiply it and subtract. Now it matches. It leaves out a very fundamental question. What would be the point of having a measurement in the pyramid or what other ancient structure? There's no message about the measurement. There's just the measurement itself, right? Why is it there? Just so someone can go, it matches with the circumference of the Earth or something like that? So that what's the message? Just like, so you know that they were very advanced scientifically? That's the message? That's all they wanted you to know? It just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense,
Yes. Yeah, this is a good point. Where's the message? If we had a text that complemented them coming up with messages, we don't have that. We don't have the ancient Egyptians saying, hey, this is evidence that they have the knowledge of the gods or something, which could be.
If they said like the distance to the sun and had the measure, this would be something. Wow, look at that. We know the Greeks, like Eratosthenes, figured out the circumference of the Earth, or the diameter of the Earth. Or is the circumference, the size of the Earth, anyway.
Right.
But we're told that he did it and how he did it, But in this, you're not getting any explanation like that. It's just looking for a number that matches. That's all.
And they do this in South America. You find the pyramids, they find measurements, they try to get links. They're trying to do this almost anywhere where they find structures that leave us in awe. And I think that is the point of the structure, is to give you an awe-like response to this presence of this massive thing that's trying to go up to the sky, with humans constantly looking up to the sky, wondering, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. This kind of mesmeration we've had towards stars and sun and all of the planets and such for so long as deities way, way back. So are there any other kinds of things you've been tackling lately that are alternative? I like to use the term alternative.
Yeah,
pseudo makes them feel defensive and makes it.
People get upset when you say pseudo-archaeology or something like that. I have some little short videos I do called Things or Alternative Ancient History People Can't Explain, and I'll have things like that. Sometimes I do say pseudo, sometimes I might say fantasy archaeology or something like that.
Right.
But alternative is fine. And I think it's a little bit more, they think of it as less of a slur. But anyway, the most common thing I deal with is, because they're looking for evidence of a lost advanced civilization, and no one has ever found anything from it, what they'll do is, the most common thing is, they'll find things that have already been found and attributed to a known civilization, and just say, well, no, it's not from that known civilization. It's from the lost ancient civilization that I believe in. So, whether it be the Sphinx or whatever, this thing was made actually not when archaeologists or historians say it was made thousands of years earlier. So I deal with that because, although I don't do prehistory, their lost advanced civilization is in the prehistoric period, but they do go into ancient history, which is what I do, to take structures, artifacts, whatever, which they call sometimes parts, out of place artifacts. And they'll say, oh, well, the establishment assigned this artifact to this time period, but actually doesn't belong in this time period. It's out of place. It belongs in this advanced civilization I'm talking about. So then I deal with that. Like, how do we know that this artifact belongs where they say it belongs, right? So I'll look at the scientific dating methods, things like that, like how it fits into where it is. The most common argument is used to support this idea is that this artifact couldn't have been made by the known civilization. So it's a kind of a negative argument, right? It's not that, well, we have a method of dating this artifact that is superior than the archaeologist dating method, and that's how we know it's older. No. They just say, you have to doubt what the archaeologists say because look at this artifact. It could not possibly have been made by this known civilization.
Can you
For
give
what
us an
reason?
example of
Yeah.
one case that, because I know exactly what you're saying. I'll
Mhm.
throw just an idea out there, but I'd love to get, you might have a better example, is to look at the stones underneath certain buildings
Mhm.
and they'll go, look how massive this is, and look at this right angle cut, and then it has this
Yeah.
weird shape, like, or this cylinder shaped drill. Oh, it's a power drill that even in 1988, the name of this brand couldn't even do as much power. They come up with these
Yeah.
speculative
Yeah.
hypotheses.
The two most common things are that stone is too heavy. They could never have lifted it to move it. Okay. Examples of that would be like at Balbec in Lebanon.
Mhm.
There are these massive stones, not only in the temple there's three big ones called the trilithon there. They're 800 tons each, which are assigned to the Roman period, but also ones in the quarry that are even bigger that they never did move, but it looked like they were going to try to move them. They're like over 1,000 tons. So they'll be like, well, the Romans could never have moved an object this heavy. It's only, by the way, a half a mile slightly downhill from the quarry to the temple, so it's not that really far to get there. But they're like, no, there's no way they could have done it. So they'll do things like that. Now, for that one, my way of countering that is what I say, well, wait a minute, let's look at the context of all the things that are at the archaeological site. The thing they don't really like to look at is like, what else is there,
Mhm.
right? That'll give us clues as to when this thing was made. And the fact is, at Baalbek, there are levels, there were things that were built that were earlier than this, like these large megaliths. There are things underneath the megaliths going all the way back to a Neolithic village, right? Now we know it was a Neolithic village because of what was left in it. There are identifying features. So everything above it has to be later, whereas these people want to date it to before, right?
Ah,
But there
I
are
love this.
yeah, there are levels of the temples that were there before the Roman temple. There's older ones, and then buildings from earlier. So it goes back, and stratigraphy. We know the order of building from that, and but they often ignore this because they just want to say, on Ancient Aliens, they say it was a part of a landing pad for a spacecraft.
With like pottery, right? Or pottery
Yeah,
shards or other details that archaeologists who are digging will find, and they go, okay, let's just pretend 5,000 BCE. This layer way down here is 5,000. These massive stones are up here. They have to be 2,500 BCE or 2,000 or 500
yeah,
BCE or Roman era, and they're able to date these with their expertise, carbon dating, all this material. So we have to place it in a time that is after those events for those who are tracking along. And this makes us forced to have to say, almost like, it happened, but how did they do these things? And that's the
right.
thing
And
we
that's
forget
there's
about.
some things that are still unknown, right? That's another thing. Like just because we can't tell you exactly what tools were used, we know a lot about Roman tools, okay? But some cultures we don't know as much about the tools. But just because we say, well, like we don't know exactly how they made the Great Pyramid, exactly the procedures and methods and tools that they had. We have an idea, but it's a little hazy. They're like, oh, you don't know. So, we can believe whatever we want then because you don't know. But yeah, some ideas are just better than other ideas. But yeah, at Baalbek, it's a little bit harder to argue about what the Romans could or couldn't do because we have other Roman evidence of Roman construction all over the Mediterranean world. And although there aren't any megaliths quite as big as the ones in that temple, there's a huge one in Jerusalem. There's a big one there. And there are very, very heavy multi-ton objects that we know the Romans transported. Obelisks from Egypt, 300-400 tons. They're taking across the Mediterranean on boats. So we know that they could move heavy objects. Yeah, these are the heaviest that we found from that period. but there's always going to be a heaviest, and just because it's heavier than the rest, that doesn't necessarily mean like, well, they couldn't do it,
Right. Do we
Go
know
ahead.
any methods of how they would have moved some of these? I mean,
Yeah, I
sometimes
mean,
there's a mystery, but do you know?
yeah, as far as, well, at Balbec, they only had to move it, like I said, about a half mile downhill. But we know the way they were carving the huge ones that they didn't move, that they were using pickaxes and things like that to go underneath it. They shaped the whole thing, and then they were going underneath it. We know that there were holes in there for posts to stick in there and have ropes to hold it so it wouldn't fall, and keep it in place. They'd use, we even know about Roman clamps and things that could be put into holes and things. And then they probably, because we have like, I think 2 or 3 books by Romans on Roman construction techniques. So we actually have their words about how they do things. Now, not about Baalbek, but about things in general. We know what they were capable of. Moving it on logs, things like that, rolling it probably was the method they used. We can't prove that it was on logs, but we know that the wood could hold it. You can calculate it, the physics of it, with math. So they probably did something like that. You could have used animals to pull it, or we know they've done that elsewhere too. They talk about using a whole, there's a mention of like 100 or something animals that were like donkeys or oxen, things like that, to pull things. We know that they did it, so you put 2 and 2 together. Even if you don't know specifically about Baalbek, you can put 2 and 2 together and make some educated guesses.
My brain wants to go back to Egypt each time this happens. So we have like 500 miles away. They say there's is it granite stone that's
Yeah, there's
quarried? Not most of the pyramids, but there's a lot of that. And so if someone's doubting that they could have done that, what do you say to that?
Well, one of the things I point to is that in later times, like in the Roman times, we have abundant evidence of granite being used. Cut, moved, huge granite pillars, hundreds of them moved all throughout the empire. We're talking about really big around granite monolithic pillars, not in sections, single pillars going all the way up. These are heavy, being moved around the Mediterranean and quarried. We even have some still in the quarries and so forth, So then to say, well, yeah, but the Egyptians, they lived before that, their technology wasn't as developed. Okay, maybe, but maybe the Romans learned it from the Egyptians. You don't know. The point is, they're saying you need modern or postmodern tools and equipment to do it. And if the Romans could do it, that means that you don't need modern equipment to do it. It can be done the old-fashioned way. People get so used to using modern tools that they can't imagine what it was like before. Yes, we used to wash the dishes without a dishwasher before.
I like how
Sorry
you're
if my
using
dog barking. I
Rome.
don't know if you hear that, but
Oh, you're fine. It's okay. Yeah, I like how you're using Rome as kind of guys, we can all really go to this place and see that Rome could do it. And I've actually had my brother-in-law, we have these conversations and he kind of leans into the whole, I want to call it conspiracy ideas, but like, hey, they're not telling us the whole truth kind of stuff. And I lean into the, what does the consensus say? And then if I disagree with the consensus, at least let me understand it and then go from there, because I know what it's like to believe things before knowing what experts in the field actually think. And it's important that you go that route. And I always joke around and go, do you want to go to a witch doctor for your brain cancer or an expert on the brain who knows the frontal lobe cortex, the midbrain, and understands the neurons, et cetera, and how to, it's like, which one are you picking here? So as far as that, I like that you go to Rome, because my brother he'll say, yeah, but the Romans could do that. Like we have good reason to think they could do that. We don't have as good of a reason to think they could do that in Egypt and these massive and stack them that high and all that. Kara Cooney, who Egyptologist I recently interviewed, love her. She's amazing. She's like, that's kind of the point of what they were trying to do, is make you look and go, only a god could have done this. She even speculates and says that when the building of it may have happened, they could have, and she said this is not the most common position, but they could have found a way internally to build it the outside first so that it looked almost like it's building itself. That we don't know exactly how it got built, but could you imagine even the locals looking at this building that's building itself? A god might have done this. Who knows exactly how they did it? But she's like, that's the point. The Pharaoh wants you to be like, these guys are gods. They are absolutely from the heavens and they're connected. You know what I mean?
And it's funny, I get a lot of people, it's amazing how many people who believe in this saying, well, build a pyramid then, and then I'll believe you. I want to see you build an exact replica of the Great Pyramid, and if you do that, then I'll believe you. But until then, I I think they're making a big ask like that because they know you're never going to do it. Why don't you make one then? They'll say. But the point is, we never have to do that in science, where you actually have to replicate the whole. We know things exist. We know planets are out there, and so you don't have to get in a spaceship and go and look at the planet. We know from other indications, right, of the signs that we get of what is there and what can be done. And the same thing with building things. Look at the different parts of the process of building a pyramid or any other great structures, right? What would they have to do? Oh, they'd have to carve out the stones. All right, look at. We can carve stones, okay? With the tools that they had, we can carve stones with it. All right. Well, yeah, but you had to lift it. You had to. Well, look at we can move these heavy stones with using this primitive process right here. We don't know if that's the process they use, but look at we can do it, right? And they name other processes, and you say, well, look, we can do that. Well, look, we can do that. Oh, yeah, we can carve granite. Look at with stone, we can carve granite. You do all the individual processes, and then they'll say, yeah, but you didn't build the whole thing. But what I'm saying is when they could do the individual processes that make up the whole, then why do you need to go through the whole thing and make one, right? You have enough clues to at least give you a good indication that they could have done it. You can even use the math, physics, to determine how much load and all that they could lift with this particular pulley or whatever they might have used. You can figure it out on paper. You can figure out how much time it would take. By the way, I'm working on a video about how long it would have taken to make the Great Pyramid using primitive methods, but it's a lot of research. But anyway, that's one of the projects I'm working on.
That sounds really interesting. I really want to watch that. So when that launches, I hope MythVision comes over there and shows you support in the chat and the comments, because
great.
That helps your channel, helps the brand. And I love these ideas coming from an academic who's actually spending the time to do this. I want to kind of think the alternative views in a way, while I totally disagree. And I think sometimes
play devil's advocate, as they say.
Huh?
You want to play devil's advocate?
Well, I want to thank them in one way. The one thing I appreciate about having these ideas is they inspire competition for the fact. In my own experience, I've had hypotheses brought up to me, biblical stuff, right? Mythology, theology, various things. And when a competitive idea comes forward that is not even remotely considered by any expert in the field, and even the experts disagree on things, but they don't even bat an eye at this stuff, and these people are competing with me about these ideas, it helps me want to read more books, sharpen my understanding, and get even more acquainted with how we can get closer to what the fact really is in solving it. And I wish there was more engagement from what I call ivory tower experts, those who really have this expertise, they get the career, they learn all this knowledge, and typically it's only at conferences in higher educated publications that you find this material, instead of just out there in the public engaging like what you're doing and trying to do. I thank them for that, not because I agree with anything that they're saying about this stuff. I think a lot of the stuff they say is harmful, even sometimes, for the civilizations and the peoples who actually built these things, taking it away from them. As we know, in the past, colonial ideas and racist ideas have really ran rampant, of course, as well with this stuff. But it does help us sharpen our understanding. And if it weren't for that, some people would probably never pick up the books or even want to learn more, if that makes sense.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think you're right. In fact, in preparing, these videos and all that I do, I have to check, well, how do we know that? How do we know that? Because people want to know, how do you know that? It's like when a little kid is like, why? And well, because blah, blah. Why? Well, why? It's a good thing though, because you have to explain yourself. How do you know that, right? If someone's constantly asking you, well, how do you know you can believe that? Or how do you know that? How do you know they did this? You have to have an answer, right? Yeah, so you're right. It forces you to do the research and be able to explain it, right? Maybe you took it for granted before. And you're like, well, yeah, of course, blah, blah. But it's now somebody's putting you on the spot. Well, how do you know that? So I think for that reason, you're right. They do a service in a way, right? So it's a good thing. Now they can be, they're not always nice about it, but they do put you to the test.
Exactly. That's how I feel, at least. I'm not saying anything else other than that. It's a bit competitive, and I'm interested in seeing more scholars like you and what you're doing enter the arena of dominating, because I do think that the evidence, they're closer to what the reality is than some of the more wishful thinking ideas. Because you just presented the Egyptians, you talk about how they can cut granite, they can, even with less strong objects, you add water, you add sand, you add this, you do that, you got it. It's cutting granite. They can roll on logs. They can pull with sleds and ropes. They can use water and travel up the Nile. The list can go on potential explanations for what is or could have happened to explain
People find
it.
a way, people
Yeah,
find a way. It's
exactly.
like on Star Trek where, Captain Kirk would say, Mr. Scott, how long is it going to take to fix the warp drive or whatever? He's like, it's got to be at least 3 days, Captain. He's like, I need it in an hour. And Mr. Scott finds a way of doing it. It's like, well, in ancient times, right? Well, the king's like, I want a pyramid. It's got to be the biggest one yet. Oh, man, there's no way. You find a way of doing it. Okay? You make it happen. And people are funny because they think about in terms of our own ideas about time today. They're like, oh, that would have taken way too long. I mean, just to make this one cut would have been, a whole day they've been working on it. Yeah, maybe. Those people don't think about time like we do. It's just work, just doing work. You're working all day, just like normal. Yeah, it's going to take longer, but we've got 50 other teams doing the same thing.
Mhm.
It'll get done.
Are you trying to suggest that they didn't have McDonald's back then? I can't believe you would suggest such a thing. You brought up pyramids, which would have had to be brought up. Went with Balbec in Rome, and Roman creative engineering and their skills of being able to build, and we have a little better evidence to really nail down how they would have done stuff, because they write about that. Göbekli Tepe and say, hey, whoa, what is going on here? We have this massive structure, and these are hunter gatherers. They're leaving open the room of why couldn't, if they could do that, couldn't hunter gatherers potentially even build the Sphinx, or trying to leave open that the Sphinx could have belonged to an earlier civilization. Okay, we'll give you the pyramids if we're willing to die on the hill, but the Sphinx, we got to have that Sphinx possibly go back to this ice age or during the cataclysm, the Younger Dryas, or whatever they want to try and argue. What are your thoughts about this? And do you think there might be discoveries where large structures like Göbekli Tepe are found in the Ice Age period by any chance?
I think it's certainly possible. Of course, it's worth pointing out that Göbekli Tepe and the sites around it like it are not from the period that they want the advanced civilization to be in. So they say, well, yeah, but it appeared out of nowhere. So maybe survivors of the cataclysm taught the people of Göbekli Tepe how to do it. I don't know if you've ever seen, well, of course you've seen Göbekli Tepe. There's nothing about those monuments that suggest an advanced civilization. They are more advanced than what we thought was people were able to do back at that time, but they're not like the kind of advance that you would expect this lost civilization to have, right? For example, everyone always talks about, precision cuts and all. There's no precision cuts at Göbekli Tepe, right? There's no straight. The monuments, they're not precisely cut. They have beautiful reliefs on them, wonderful. Now, people have tried to make something out of that and say, well, these images, this is code. This is a date stamp, and they're telling us the date of the cataclysm. There's all kinds of theories about that, which are just speculation, even though some people claim, like, I've proved it, But
there's no language at this time, right?
There's there's no actual writing,
right.
Think about this. Okay, if survivors from this advanced civilization, they lived and they're meeting these hunter gatherers and they want to teach them things. I don't know, maybe they're breaking them in slowly, but it's not like wow, look at how, it's exactly what you would expect for the very first sorts of monuments people are doing. They had some earlier ones in the Natufian culture, but this is the next step up. I did a whole video on this too, about how there is signs of gradual technological improvement leading up to Göbekli Tepe, and then continuing after that. There's nothing that just stands out like, wow, this just popped out of nowhere. They used to think that until they found all these other sites around Göbekli Tepe that had things like that too, even some that are earlier. Even some of these T-pillars that are even more primitive than the ones at Göbekli Tepe. So yeah, I mean, it's a great site and shows amazing capabilities of the people who live there, but nothing like you would expect people from a lost advanced civilization to show people how to do. Why didn't they show them how to write? That would have been easier, right? Wouldn't it have been easier to show them how to write? They're like, well, we're going to show you how to carve and put up big stones. Did that help them as much? I don't think so. Anyway, it's a judgment call, I guess, but it doesn't seem like the first thing that I would think of that survivors of this civilization want to teach people.
I used to think that the images of the animals and pictures that are carved on those stones may have been zodiacal.
There's a theory about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they're actually aware of the stars and that it's timekeeping and stuff like that. And I mean, I guess it's possible, but they're usually in those kind of veins is this notion that for who knows how long, because one of the interesting things, this paints the picture that I'm trying to paint, but you got to go back a little. What people like Randall Carlson will do that intrigue people like me is they'll take a ruler, they'll show you the ruler, and they'll say, this is literally written history. And this is how long Homo sapiens have been around and the same hardware that we have today. The software might have changed on how we have writing and how we address with our mediums of engaging culturally, etc. But like, what about all this time that we were as smart as we are today? We just dealt with the world a little differently software wise. He's trying to kind of give you that we forgot or we lost. Yeah. Maybe there's something that was before, and it's kind of mystique, a mystery. And they kept time. They were aware of the precession. They were understanding precession of the equinoxes, the zodiac, agricultural, all of that, which I think is Dibble debunks with the whole plant idea of showing how the plants were not domesticated and stuff going back into the Ice Age.
Well, another thing, what I often say to that argument is, and I'm not a prehistorian or anything, but
of course,
this idea that civilization was destined to come, like it's inevitable. Like if you put humans together, they live together, you're bound to get civilization. I don't think that's true. We needn't have ever invented civilization. We could have just lived rural lifestyles for the rest of our existence. Maybe we would have invented agriculture, but we didn't have to have cities. There's nothing that says we had to have cities, that it was inevitable that one day we would have iPhones. Not necessarily. For a long time, people didn't live in cities and they were actually healthier, Why not continue like that? So this idea like that you hear about like, well, we were around for so long. Why didn't we invent civilization before?
Right.
Because we didn't have to. There's nothing says that we needed to do it, but we ended up doing it, but didn't have to happen that way. That's how I kind of look at it. But
no, that's an interesting way of looking at it because it assumes with our modern situation that this happened before. We've been here before. Yeah. That's why in my recent interview with Dibble, Dr. Dibble, I said, hey, just to give you a little curiosity as to what piqued my interest when I was a believer in these alternative ideas was when they described we forgot amnesia. We're human. We forget our past, that we've been here. We've advanced to this level before, these kind of things. And I told my wife, Ryan, we were at a restaurant and I said, honey, you ever heard of Atlantis? She's never heard of Atlantis. Then I had to explain there was this civilization, advanced civilization. They had capabilities kind of like we do. And then they pretty much sinned against the gods at the time. And the gods sent a deluge and like they're underwater somewhere, and kind of tied it into this Younger Dryas, rising of sea levels, all this kind of stuff that Randall and Graham were saying. And then I said, in 30,000 years, someone might be at a dinner table at a restaurant, because humans probably had restaurants, again, coming back to this point you're nailing down now. And the man says to his partner, hey, you ever heard of the story of America? And she goes, "Ooh," and I go, "Ooh, yeah, I know. Imagine we've been lost. All they have are these faces, rock cut out on Mount Rushmore, little signs that we might have been here. This great civilization. There's something that about that myth, that idea, that is intriguing. You know?
I think a lot of it, because I see this in the way people talk about it, the idea that we've done it before, there is sort of, as part of this idea that this is a message for us today. If we don't want that to happen, we need to change our ways. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
almost has a doomsday kind of feel to it. Like, there was a
Right.
doomsday before, and there could be a doomsday again if we don't play. We need to behave ourselves, or this could happen again. I think that that's part of it, right? That maybe people find appealing, like, let's learn from the past. Also, there's this idea that maybe we have a terrible world today, so maybe this lost civilization, maybe if we can find it, they will teach us important lessons, that they learned, and we just need to look for it. If we can find it, they'll tell us something. They'll give us some kind of secret that we need in order to survive, or, whatever. I think people like that idea too.
I think you're right. And then when you discover Neanderthal bones looking like humans are actually scraping the last bits of meat off of them to eat the flesh, and what the reason behind that is, who knows? But some speculate that they want to consume some part of their own loved one because they think they're partaking of them and carrying
Oh,
on something.
oh, so we're kind of doing that.
I
Maybe.
know, right? But like I guess what I'm getting at is like, once we discover what may be the case, it's not this mystique thing as they want it to be. It's a different kind of interesting, almost survival. It's mind blowing how they had to live to survive. That's
Mhm.
a different, their entire mind was not, I'm going to carve this cup and I'll probably take about 3 months to do it, but I'm going to carve this cup today. Like, how do you have the time to carve
Yeah,
a cup?
in certain periods of time, there's just you can't do that. There, you got to worry about feeding just the children. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, another thing I should mention is a common argument about how the ancients aren't able to do this, and you touched on it a little bit. Is they'll talk about this idea of, and this goes back to Christopher Dunn, but this idea about precision cuts. Right? Look at this thing was made so perfectly. Look at the cuts on this. Okay, it was made so perfectly, and often they're talking about like boxes or vases or whatever. And look at how perfectly it was cut. No way that the ancient Egyptians made that, or the ancient whoever. There's no possible way, because it's just made too perfectly. Now, normally when I see something like that, if someone says like, "Look at how well this was made," my first response is, "Wow, those ancient people, they were good at their job. Look at the craftsmen that made this," or whatever, right? But some people, their response is like, "There is no possible way those people. It must have been a more advanced civilization that did it," which is interesting. And so it's a really popular thing. People are getting like high-tech machines to measure stone vases from Egypt and putting it through the computer and everything. And they're like, "Look at this, is like accurate to within 1/1000th of an inch. It's amazing." Therefore, the Egyptians couldn't have done it.
Right. The faces. One, I can't remember where there's like a sarcophagus or something of a face of a pharaoh or of a god, and it's so perfectly proportioned. And I know exactly kind of what you're talking
Yeah.
about. It may be a different thing that you're describing that someone else is saying about, but yeah, like they couldn't do it. And this it begs the question to ask you your personal opinion. Is this a leftover fossil of the colonial
Well,
concepts, or do we not need to go there? And do we just say, you know what, maybe it's just ignorance
yeah,
and
well, it
people.
is. I mean, people today, they don't know where all this stuff comes from. But yeah, those ideas first began to be bandied about back then. It's taken on a more, 21st century tone with all this, the precision instruments and all of this kind of thing.
Right.
And it makes it seem scientific, but there's just a logical problem with it at its core, and that is that somehow the measurement, by taking the measurement of something and showing how, close it is to being exactly what it should be, that this is proof that somebody couldn't do it. That's kind of an interesting argument, but is that used in any of the sciences for anything else? This is kind of a made up idea where just because something is really great, okay, really perfect, that only a machine tool could have done it, right?
Right.
That you can't do it by hand. You can't achieve perfection by hand. You can only achieve perfection with a machine tool, an advanced computerized or something tool.
Right.
Could only have done it. This is the idea that they haven't actually established, but they always fall back on, well, if you think it can be made by hand, do it then. And I'm like, well, I'm a historian. I'm not an artisan. I'd probably have to do it for 20, 30 years before I can get it right, Well,
Right.
you're not willing to, the burden of proof's on you, but they actually haven't established this basic principle that somehow the measurement is what tells you whether it was made by hand or not. I've never seen it used anywhere else where they're like, well, the measurement shows that it wasn't made by hand. I doubt the veracity of this particular claim. But
I love that. The way you
and
describe
also
that.
they're doing it on things like, it's a vase, okay? You put stuff in it, okay? It's a vase that you put stuff in. Why would they use special tools to make just a vase, And usually the response is, well, they made the tool to make other things, but since they had it, they thought, well, let's just do it on the vase too. It's there's things missing in the logic of all of this, But it plays well to a lot of people because it looks sciencey, Oh, we're measuring with the instruments. Look at, we've got, the computer drawing of the whole thing and all the measurements. We're doing science, everybody. And the science shows that the Egyptians couldn't do it.
Right. I've seen, so there was actually a documentary that reached out to me and wanting me to participate as a skeptic on it, where they were pitching it to Netflix to try and see. I don't know why they chose me. I'm not like any expert at all. I'm just an average Joe YouTuber who loves talking about this stuff. But they wanted me to come on as the skeptic, and they wanted to like present these things. And they sent me these documentaries to show, like, they already have them ready, but they're trying to pitch them to YouTube, or not YouTube, but Netflix. And they're showing like a room somewhere in India that's so polished and shiny.
Oh, the Barabar caves.
Yeah, that had to be done by machines.
Yeah.
It's
that
not
documentary
even
just came out on YouTube, by the way. Yeah, well, they've taken a roughness detector, and it just tells you how rough the wall is, and they're just like, ooh, look how smooth the wall is. It's within so many microns of perfection.
Yep.
But they just show you a couple of samples. Just go here, and then go here, and then go here. Take a little sample, and they're like, oh, look at these really accurate readings. When you can see with your naked eye that a lot of it isn't, But that alone, basically, and they also do this thing about acoustics, like, oh, the acoustics are perfect in here. No way the Indians could have done this. There's just no way. So yeah, it's all the same idea, but I just think there's something missing in the step-by-step logic of this, that somehow just by measuring it, you've proven something,
Right. I appreciate you pointing that out, because I've never had anyone I've spoken to address the problem with it. It sounds almost to me like they're trying to work backwards. Again, we were talking about the measurements of the pyramids, and you're like, okay, why? Where's the message? What's the story? So they really did a good job in smoothing out these walls and doing this carving. And I'm not trying to like downplay that. That's significant. However, what's the message? You have these numbers in your head, you bring an interpretation to it, and now you have this message, assuming modern technology, assuming they had this knowledge of the earth, and that interpretation, because numbers can do almost anything you want them to if you try hard enough. You're pointing there's a flaw in that. Like, unless we have a text complementing it or an inscription, something somehow telling us that was their goal, that's what they're trying to do. We shouldn't make assumptions.
Corroborating evidence, right, to go with it. Like, maybe it would mean something if you had more that you could show to bolster the idea, right? Other things that have been discovered in context with it that also somehow give an indication of something. But if it's only just the measurements all the time, oh, I measured this and it's like almost perfect, and that's all you have, it isn't really enough to show anything. Yeah,
exactly.
Also, it's very weird. They love the plain, unadorned buildings and artifacts. Things are just like just rectangles and squares and circles and flat, you know. They could look at like an amazing temple with all this intricate carving of deities and all kinds of things on it in India, and they're like, oh, anybody could do that. I mean, and then they look at the plain, bare bones, nothing, just a room with nothing in it, blank, flat walls, you know, and they're like, ooh, this is amazing. It's very interesting.
Or the lower levels, again, you know, using your analogy from Balbec and the lower civilizations, but these lower stones that are massive tons in regions in South America and China and in Canada. I mean, you might, you know, find these various building structures all over the world, and they're fascinated with it. They come with this idea that there's got to be a connection, and some go further into the fiction and saying there had to be a race of giants that were strong enough to build these kind of things. And I get the temptation, because I think a lot of scholars in the arenas I interview of like Old Testament academics, biblical scholars and stuff will say what might have happened. And they're just going with the best case possible. Ronald Hindle, for example, or others. These, due to climate change, due to having to be nomadic in some way and moving from region to region, people may move into a massive structure and say, this is huge. No humans would have built this. Giants must have built these massive structures. In some cases, there might be reason for the imagination of people. For example, I think it's Robert Cargill wrote a book called Cities That Built the Bible. And what he's talking about is locations, geographic locations, and natural phenomena from the regions helped articulate the story, like Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. Dead Sea, anybody? You can see pillars of salt all over the Dead Sea, and why that would have inspired the narrative for someone to come up with that story.
I speculated about Atlantis in this regard, because people look at the Reshat structure in Africa. You know, it's a natural formation, but it looks like a bunch of circles. And it fits Plato's description and all that. And I speculated that you never know. There could have been some ancient Greeks who saw that thing and developed the Atlantis story around it. You know, didn't necessarily. People are saying, well, maybe it was Atlantis. Probably not. But I mean, people might have saw it in ancient times and thought, oh, this could be something here, you know, maybe, and the story developed maybe around it. I can't prove that, but it makes some sense, you know.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's more that we could, you know, discover using that kind of observation pertaining to stories all across the world. I'm sure that plays a role.
It's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't mind the speculation. Speculation is fine. And in fact, when I first started making videos on the subject, I had to first think to myself, like, all right, now, is it possible? Is it possible? Maybe there could have been, right?
Right.
And I investigated, you know, basically what signs do we have that maybe this could have happened? Or even, not even if we had any evidence for it, but like, could it have happened and we just haven't found the evidence yet? Is this possible? People think like I automatically took the party line right from the very beginning, but no, I did look into it. And then I'm like, well, when I couldn't find anything, then I'm like, well, let's see what everyone else is saying about it. Like, what does Graham Hancocks and all those types of people say? And then I look at their evidence, and afterward, I'm like, that's it. That's all I got, you know. And that's just kind of how it developed. But I was open, you know. I even after going through school, getting my PhD in ancient history, all of that, I still said, let me entertain this idea. Maybe it could be, you know, is it possible?
That leads me to the last question I want to ask you today. I'd love to have you back, and I hope many MythVision supporters come and support you, subscribe to you, follow you on Twitter, YouTube, subscribe to his YouTube channel, all of that. Your last video was a polite takedown, but very direct on pointing out the flaw of the alternative hypotheses. I'll just say people, proponents of alternative hypotheses, who are doing the kind of the guild academics. They're against us. They don't want to see the facts. They're all just religious minded dogmatists. They can't be open to this. And there are people who show up, guarantee you will show up in this comment section just like that. They have the same mindset. How do we fix this problem, in your opinion, online? How do we create an environment where that is not being done? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be there, but If people are aware of the, the tactic, if you want to call it that, they'll maybe be less likely to fall for it. Because basically, it does a lot of heavy lifting. Like, if you don't have a lot to support your theory, you can just say, well, there's more here, but, it's the establishment that they're telling you that I don't have anything, but actually they know I do, and I'm just a threat to them and whatever. They're arrogant, they're ego driven, resistant to change, they're elitist, whatever you want to call them. And people say, oh, yeah, okay.
They might even find an example of a case where that may be the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they make it universal for all and always.
And if you've had a personal experience, like where the government really stuck it to you, or, somebody in charge of something, you had a bad experience in the past, you'll be more likely, that's how they are. That's how they are. And then you'd be more likely to accept what this person might be selling, because he's on your side. He's like, we're the little guy, right? We're fighting against the man, right? Come with me, we got to stick up for our rights and so forth. But that isn't really what ancient history is about. Ancient history is about the evidence, right? It's not about, if you want to know what really happened, it's not about like what team you're on. Mm-hmm. It's about the evidence. That's what it's about. I worry that even with people, archaeologists, historians, academics, that they too sometimes get into this team mindset, and I don't think it's healthy. It's not us versus them. I would love to break apart that whole idea of us versus them, but I don't think you ever really totally get rid of it. You can help individuals, but you can't stop. I don't think, though, because there's always going to be people who are like that. It's been, since time immemorial, people have been like that. So you just appeal to individuals. It's the most you can do.
Ladies and gentlemen, go subscribe to Dr. David Miano. I really appreciate
World
you.
Of Antiquity. Yeah.
Called you an archaeologist at the start, historian. I'm sure you've done some archaeology along your travels, but
archaeology comes into play a lot when you do ancient history, so I rely on archaeologists quite a bit. But as a historian, I deal mostly with documents.
Right. Well, go check out his YouTube channel. There's so much good material, so many videos, and you discuss these ideas, you spearhead them, you address them the best you can, bringing evidence. And I think, to be fair, your last video, what I loved about it, and it wasn't about evidence so much in terms of like, here's an argument and you're trying to deal and take apart. It was almost a different style video than what you're used to doing. You actually went for the psychology of like, here's the manipulative methods. And like you said, the heavy lifting of just painting the other side as the villain who has this conspiracy against you. And you give a few examples of bad actors along the way. You've done so. It's like the same thing with evolution. Well, look at how they fabricated these bones in this example over here. That's what they're doing with all of evolution, and therefore human evolution. And, all of these things are false because we found a few bad apples along the way. And the same thing I seem is that Graham is using with Joe, and Joe is susceptible to that big time. He already was, as you pointed out.
I heard this, that in the past he actually doubted the moon landing as well, but he's since come over to the right side on that. But so it just shows that Joe can be swayed by some of these things. Yeah.
Right. I hate to ask you this, but Dibble seemed to even have Joe coming to his side toward the end of this.
I saw that too. I was like, Joe, I thought Joe was going to side with Graham the whole time, but no, he didn't. He didn't. So I thought that was good.
There's still hope yet. Thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Leave a comment, share the video, subscribe to his channel, and let him know that you came over from MythVision. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, it'd be great to know. Thank you.